Welcome to today's Explainer. We are taking on an incredibly complex subject right now, but honestly, it's one that's absolutely crucial for understanding our modern world. We're looking at the anatomy of extremism. You know, when we turn on the news, we usually only see the visible violence, that final, tragic outcome. But today, we're going underground. We're going to use a roots and branches concept to map out exactly how complex societal soil feeds into those visible branches of extreme violence.
Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We've got this broken down into 4 clear parts. 1. The roots of violence. 2. Personal and historical triggers. 3. Motivations and manifestations. And 4. The modern terror landscape. Let's get to it.
All right, before we really get going, let's set an objective baseline. Terrorism is never a single-factor issue. It's this deeply interlinked web of political, social, economic, and psychological causes. It grows in a very specific environment, an environment where individuals or groups become entirely convinced that violence isn't just an option, but literally the absolute only method left to achieve their aims.
So, Part 1, the roots of violence, systemic failures. Like I said, before we look at the headlines, we have to dig into the systemic roots. And this illustrates the foundation of the problem perfectly. Think of it like a giant, tragic puzzle with 4 overlapping forces: political disenfranchisement, social exclusion, economic inequality, and state failure. Now, these aren't happening in isolation. When citizens are denied a political voice and marginalized communities face social exclusion, well, resentment brews. Add in severe economic inequality and top the whole shebang off with state failure, where weak governance leaves a massive security vacuum. When these 4 systemic failures overlap, they create the perfect vacuum for extremism.
Let's actually anchor these abstract ideas to some concrete historical realities. Politically, when participation is denied, you get movements like the Naxalite insurgency in India, which morphed from a protest over land inequality into violent conflict. Socially, marginalized identity conflicts, like the fallout of the 1992 Mumbai riots, can act as massive catalysts for radicalization. Economically, prolonged poverty makes youth highly vulnerable to recruitment, which really paved the way for the Taliban's rise in Afghanistan. And finally, a complete security vacuum from a weak state, that allowed for the rapid post-2003 expansion of ISIS.
Now, systemic failures create the dry brush, right? But they still need a spark. That brings us to Part 2, personal and historical triggers, the human element.
The crucial point here is that these broad systemic failures are experienced on a deeply personal level. Psychologically, feelings of trauma, humiliation, and a desperate desire for belonging play a massive role. Actually, a really surprising takeaway is that many ISIS recruits were individuals experiencing a profound identity crisis, just feeling isolated in their own communities. It highlights how much of this is about a human need for belonging rather than purely ideology. Then, of course, you do have ideological and religious triggers, where distorted interpretations of belief systems provide a moral justification for violence, as seen in the tragic 9/11 attacks. And finally, historical triggers, like long-standing disputes, colonial pasts, and unhealed territorial wounds. Terrorist organizations are experts at exploiting these deep human vulnerabilities to recruit. To really see the power of those historical triggers, we only need to look at the Kashmir conflict. It is a prime example of how long-standing, unresolved political grievances and territorial disputes don't just fade away with time. Unaddressed historical wounds become this permanent source of resentment, capable of fueling generational violence and being continuously exploited.
Okay, so we've spent all this time looking underground at the systemic, psychological, and historical roots. But it begs the question, how do these hidden roots actually manifest in the real world? How do they grow into the violence we see on our screens?
Which leads us to Part 3, motivations and manifestations, the branches. If the causes are the roots, these are the branches they produce.
What's really fascinating here is how the underlying objective completely shapes the method of violence. For political terrorism, the goal is influencing policy or regime change, tragically illustrated by the 1984 assassination of Indira Gandhi. Religious terrorism views violence as a sacred duty, which was the motive behind the devastating 2008 Mumbai attacks. And then ethnic or nationalist terrorism is driven by demands for identity protection and self-determination. A clear example of this is how the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka utilized extreme tactics to demand a separate state. Different goals, entirely different branches.
We see this play out clearly across the political spectrum too, where starkly contrasting ideologies use shockingly similar violent methods. Left-wing terrorism, historically exemplified by the Red Brigades in Italy, aims to violently overthrow capitalist systems to force an egalitarian society.
Conversely, right-wing terrorism is motivated by extreme anti-democratic ideologies that fiercely oppose social change, such as the horrifying 2011 Norway attacks. Both represent completely opposite societal visions, yet both end up resorting to extreme violence to try and force their will.
But here's the thing. As our world has globalized, these traditional branches, they've mutated. Welcome to Part 4, the modern terror landscape and its evolving threats.
What we're dealing with today is a total blurring of the lines. You have state-sponsored terrorism, where actual governments use massive resources to fund proxy groups without ever officially declaring war. Then you've got narco-terrorism. Cartels in Mexico, for example, use extreme terror tactics not for political ideology, but simply to protect illicit drug profits and territory. We even see eco-terrorism, where groups use arson against industries to try and halt environmental destruction. The motivations have diversified in ways we really wouldn't have imagined a few decades ago.
But honestly, maybe the biggest game changer is happening completely out of sight. Cyber terrorism is growing rapidly simply because of our absolute dependence on technology. The 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack was a massive wake-up call for the world. It proved that malicious actors can disrupt financial systems, hospital communications, and global infrastructure entirely remotely. Not a single physical weapon was fired, yet the disruption was worldwide.
And all this digital and global interconnectedness feeds directly into international terrorism. Attacks like Paris in 2015 and Mumbai in 2008 demonstrate a terrifying reality. Modern communication tech and global instability allow for lethal cross-border coordination. These networks are no longer confined by geography. They recruit, finance, and plan on a transnational scale. And that makes counterterrorism incredibly difficult because it fundamentally requires complex, sustained cooperation among multiple different nations.
So we've traced the anatomy of extremism, from its deepest systemic roots all the way up to the modern digital branches of violence. It is a complex, deeply interconnected web. So I want to leave you with this final thought. As globalization connects our world closer than ever before, making these threats completely borderless, how can we, as a global society, proactively address these deep root causes before they have the chance to grow into tomorrow's violence? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.